All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. Talked a lot about this project. So if you've heard me talk about this before in various other venues, I apologize for repeating stuff. So basically what we have here is the former Company Line neighborhood in Mansfield was a working class community formed by Southern Black migrants seeking good industrial jobs in the North in the early 20th century. Steel mills of Mansfield drew laborers from both the South and Eastern Europe. Racial policies and pressures in Mansfield influenced Black people could live. Although family ties and close locations of places of work appear as important in the choices Black families made about where to live. The Company Line neighborhood developed on lots first platted as a Hoffer addition in the late 19th century, with a steel mill initially establishing housing alongside a reformatory road and renting it to employees. As a Hoffer addition developed into a primarily Black neighborhood, became an attractive location for other Black families to buy lots, put up homes, and establish families there. Strong community ties and values held the neighborhood together until the policy of urban development resulted in the complete demolition of this neighborhood in the early 1970s to make way for an industrial development. So, how did this former residential neighborhood become the focus of an archaeological excavation? This portion of the old neighborhood alongside Wise Avenue in Mansfield was included in the project area for the US 30 Improvement Project, sponsored by ODOT. The archaeology survey for that project encountered remnants of the Company Line neighborhood. Before we even put a shovel in the ground, however, we did some preliminary research on the entire project area, so we had an idea of what to expect in any particular area. Immediately, we noted on old topographic maps a small area of houses in one part of the project area, where there weren't any today. So naturally, this piqued our interest, and we started doing some further investigation. We looked at old aerial photographs, and it became apparent that the houses within the actual project area looked to have only been existed for about 20 years, immediately after the end of World War II. As the project progressed and research continued, it became apparent that this old neighborhood was special, representing post-war African American residences. Rarely are occupations of this time period the subject of archaeological analysis, and because the road project required a survey, we were given the chance to see if there was the potential to use archaeology to investigate this period of history and themes associated with post-war life, specifically in the adaptations of Black communities to nationwide trends, such as mass consumption and the creation of modern home life. Because of the nature of the project schedule and budget, we are unfortunately unable to expand our research identifying and contacting former residents during the fieldwork and reporting phase. But we did talk with some afterwards as a result of our presentations for local groups in Mansfield, which gave further insight to our findings. The area containing the Company Line neighborhood was rural in nature. Let's see, is this the right slide? No, maybe not. Nature up until the end of the 19th century, when encroaching development from Mansfield first appeared with the creation of platted housing developments and large industrial plants, then followed by the construction of US 30 around the middle of the 20th century, and expansion of light industry and prison facilities here. The company was originally platted as the Hoffer Edition in 1887. As official records and newspaper accounts refer to the neighborhood by this name, I'm going to use it interchangeably with the Company Line neighborhood presentation, which is what the residents knew it as. Hoffer Edition is historically significant as it became one of Mansfield's earliest neighborhoods, primarily African American from its beginning. Mansfield does have a history of Black residents dating back to 1820, and African American residences have been present throughout city limits ever since. Because of Mansfield's small size relative to larger cities, it did not reach the same levels of segregation of white and Black people. Neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools were more integrated in the mid-20th century than popular history of America as a whole would characterize that time period. Black people in Mansfield in the antebellum period came as freemen from the east or freed slaves from the south. Here we can kind of see where folks were coming from. They found employment as farm workers and laborers, domestic help for the wealthier families of the city. They worked in hotels and restaurants, in some cases owned businesses such as barbershops. There wasn't very much written about the 19th century African American population, but the census data from 1830 to 1890 allows a broader picture to be painted. So the 1830 census is the first census for Mansfield to identify race. There are 8 Black people listed. The 1840 census shows 7 people. Both censuses only identify African Americans by name if they're living in their own home. Those living with white families unidentified. So in 1850, the census data starts getting better. It lists everybody in the household by name. Now in 1850, we've got 51 Black people listed in Mansfield. Only one family, however, still present from 1830 census, which was the farmer James Brown. The 1860 census has some issues, with at least one known African American family is white, and only 20 total African Americans identified. It may be there was indeed a decline in the population of African Americans between 1850 and 1860, but I think that's unlikely. I think it's simply error in the census data, especially when you go to 1870 and there's 77 Black people present, 136 in 1880. 1890 census, unfortunately, largely destroyed by fire, and no records remain for Mansfield. So we jump to 1890, and it shows there's 4 African Americans present. Although, again, there's still some issues with transcribed data, misidentifying some white people as Black. The place of birth for heads of households and people listed as individuals, which shows that Ohio is actually the most common place of birth in the 19th century for Mansfield's Black population, followed closely by Virginia, then Tennessee and Pennsylvania, and only a few people from the Deep South or Atlantic coastal states. The census also gives you what people are doing. Servant, barber, and laborer are the most common occupations. Fair number of people working hotels as porters, waiters, and cooks. And then plasterers, whitewashers, and painters were another notable occupation group. Interesting individual jobs included a gunsmith and a stove mounter. So initially, African Americans lived side by side with whites in Mansfield, especially in areas with recent Eastern European immigrants. 1880 and 1900 show street locations that allows us to see where people live within the city. Even late in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, Mansfield is fairly integrated racially, although definitely not according to class. In the middle upper class residents, Black people are listed as individual servants in white households or absent altogether. Redlining practices by businesses operating property sales and management in the early to mid 20th century began to affect where African Americans could live. One former North End remembered Black people had problems buying homes outside working class neighborhoods. And often families had to purchase property using an intermediary to hide the fact that the ultimate purchaser was African American. As a result, primarily African American neighborhoods began to develop, such as the camps and the company line. Although first platted in the 19th century, the residential development of this neighborhood is tied directly to the establishment of the Mansfield Sheet and Tin Plate Company in 1912, which later became Empire Steel. The steel mill hired non-white labor from the start due to the small labor pool in Mansfield that precluded strict segregation and hiring practices for large enterprises. Although the best jobs were still reserved for white laborers. Most Black steel mill workers in the early 20th century were young unmarried men and from states like Georgia and Alabama, and often boarded with Black couples running boarded houses in the Flats neighborhood just north of downtown. These laborers were part of the Great Migration, which began around 1916 as Black Southerners moved in great numbers to northern industrial cities for better paying jobs. Often after getting settled in a job at the mill, the young men from the South sent for extended families and friends to come join them. The company line neighborhood takes its name after the line of company houses owned by the steel mill and rented to workers that stood alongside reformatory along the north side of the neighborhood. In her 2011 dissertation on race relations in Mansfield, Alison Gribble notes this neighborhood began as a community when a Black family, the McAtees, moved into the old farmhouse on Reformatory Road. Richland County's engineer's office shows how here present as early 1890. By 1920, the steel mill was renting those homes on Reformatory to Black laborers. A similar community developed west of the steel mill, the camps. That became somewhat integrated in the 1950s in comparison to the company line. My research into the residency of the company line neighborhood used law ownership indices, newspaper accounts, city directories, and census research using data available mainly at ancestry.com, which has become a really great resource. City directories for Mansfield in the 1920s suggest up to 17 residences alongside Reformatory Road, although the 1920 census only lists 12 houses, and the 1930 census only lists 11 houses. It seems probable that city directories were counting borders within some of the houses. Of the people listed in the directories, all individuals who could be found in the state are African American, while several not present in the census of last names are associated with known African American residents of Mansfield, such as Lindsay, Pringle, Bruce, and Ferguson. The census data is more useful in understanding the early demographics of the neighborhood, although the latest available census records predate the occupation of our specific study area. In the 20th century, lot ownership was primarily white, with two black lot owners, which were the married couple, George and Harriet Barker. Although they were residents of the neighborhood, George Barker is highly significant in the figure in Mansfield history, as he was the earliest documented African American property owner in the city. He was born in slavery in Western Virginia in 1842 and was a hotel cook in Mansfield as early in 1870, which is an occupation he appears to have held his entire life. Harry Barker was born in 1844 in Virginia. George Barker built a house in Wood Street in 1875. It was known as the center of African American social life in the city, and it's still standing today. The demographics of lot ownership began to shift towards more black ownership in the 1920s, which is also when homes started to appear in numbers in the northern part of the Hoffer Addition. Black lot owners in 1925, George Barker, Jim Pringle, and Leonard T. Wisdom. In the 1950s, lot ownership along Wise Avenue in particular was primarily black, with 15 known black lot owners and only 8 white lot owners. The massive increase in black lot ownership also coincides with the first development of residents on the lots along Wise Avenue in the late 1940s. Census records show only black people present in 1920 and 1940. Steel mill was a primary source of occupation then, although by 1940 the lingering effects of the Great Depression are seen, where the most common occupation then was WPA laborer. There's only one steel mill worker left, suggesting that residents were laid off from mill work and they looked at federal deal programs to help workers. Dawson census data showed birthplaces in southern states. Poverty was definitely an issue. As conspicuously being of higher income than his neighbors. It appears that even though home ownership rates increased over renting over time, residential turnover in early years of company line neighborhood was frequent. I looked at information from city directories and the census, and it shows only one family consistently present throughout 1920 through 1940. And actually was the McAtee household who was there in the early 19th century. It looks like workers in the neighborhood where opportunity presented to find better accommodations or even purchase a home elsewhere, or conversely, if a resident lost a job and could no longer afford rent. Newspaper accounts from the post-World War II era and information from residents depict problems within the company line neighborhood, specifically along Wise Avenue. 1959, Mansfield News Journal reported about residents complaining about water supply. And they have, quote, been served with a patched-up line which lies either too close to the surface or on the surface of the ground. In 1963, the Hoffer Addition was formed next to the city of Mansfield. On this, noted that this addition was 88 acres and had 55 houses. A subsequent article recorded that shortly after annexation, the city surveyed housing conditions and documented houses in the Hoffer as dilapidated and recommended the elimination of the addition and conversion to industrial use. Note that despite this pejorative term dilapidated, many of these houses would barely have been 15 years old at that point, especially along Wise Avenue. These 1950 eras photos of Wise Avenue from a 1990s neighborhood reunion pamphlet show neat houses and well-kept yards. Wise Avenue residents built many of the homes, according to former residents. It seems rather unbelievable that such recently built homes fell into a rundown state in that period of time. However, interviews conducted by the North End Oral History Project of longtime residents from the North End suggest that northern working class neighborhoods did suffer from a lack of infrastructure. A resident of a nearby Camps neighborhood talked about having dirt roads, outhouses, and no hot water well in the 1950s. And these 1950s photographs of Wise Avenue would also show a dirt road. Former residents recall issues of rats due to the proximity of the city dump on the east side of the neighborhood. In 1964, the neighborhood squarely invited the Mansfield Citizens Advisory Committee on Urban Renewal. An engineer's report put the cost of replacing water lines in the neighborhood at roughly $200,000 at modern currency value. The commission notes it would cost about $2 million in modern currency to bring the addition up to city standards, including upgraded streets, sewers, water lines, and sidewalks. However, the estimated tax returns from an industrial park were projected to be 10 times greater than currently collected from the addition. Because of the disrespect of white flight on urban tax bases, the projected tax revenue from an industrial park is likely too attractive to pass up, instead of making the investment in improved conditions in the neighborhood for residents. The use of urban renewal projects to convert Black neighborhoods into uses deemed more valuable by white community leaders is an unfortunate fact of history. And the Company Line neighborhood appears to have been yet one more example of this trend. Andrew Weiss notes that beginning in the 1940s, many suburbs took steps to demolish and redevelop existing Black communities. He quotes Stanley Tucker of the National Urban League as saying the following in 1962, quote, "There appears a tendency for suburban areas seeking to rid themselves of unsightly occupied by Negroes to ordain a new public use for the land and to remove the families without providing specific relocation arrangements elsewhere in the immediate communities." This appears to happen in Mansfield. Progress of urban renewal and residential relocation was slow. Newspaper reports document problems relocating residents due to a lack of suitable low-cost housing elsewhere in the city. By 1970, groundwater pollution was documented in the Hoffer Edition from major sewer extensions that went through the neighborhood. About 40 families were still present in the neighborhood in 1970. Urban development grant submitted by the city in 1968. This project was Mansfield's first urban renewal project. HUD received the city's bid for the project in early August of 1971, with approval granted soon after. And by 1973, the relocation was complete, with 35 households in total moved as the entire relocation process. By 1975, all the residential buildings were gone, and local businessman Warren Rupp began developing the former neighborhood into an industrial campus. Rupp was described as wanting his development to look, quote, "more like a pleasant school campus than a factory site," unquote, and the area was described as formerly being a slum by the Mansfield News Journal. The Warren Rupp pump factories occupied the northern half of the former Company Line neighborhood since then, although the southern half has remained undeveloped. Wise Avenue. This is the arrow points to Wise Avenue here. Wise Avenue itself is the last part of the neighborhood to be settled, with at least 24 houses built between 1945 and 1970, according to these aerial photographs and Richland County Engineer's office records. The 1948 aerial shows 3 completed houses north of Wise Avenue, one under construction south of the avenue. By 1955, there were 8 houses north of the avenue and 10 to the south. In 1964, there were 11 houses north and 13 houses to the south. By 1974, the next aerial, every single building was gone. Research into residents of Wise Avenue starts with engineer's office records for Hoffer Edition. It lists lot ownership throughout the years. As these houses postdate the last publicly accessible census records, newspaper accounts became the best way to identify occupants and correlate them with lot ownership. Recently, a pamphlet associated with the neighborhood reunion held in 1995 was made available, which supplements information gathered through this report. The residency along Wise Avenue began in 1943 with Howard McFadden, George Henderson, and William Lindsay. Families associated with Wise Avenue included Ford McFaddens and Henderson, along for the Waddles, Davidsons, Bowles, Bonds, Jordans, and others. Research into the Wise Avenue portion of Company Line neighborhood shows a pattern of deep family and geographical ties between the residents. Lucius Fegan was likely related to Agnes Johnson, whose maiden name was Stella Bond, was the daughter of Walter and Stella Waddell. Stella Waddell was also the niece of Leonard Wisdom, an early lot owner. George and Katie Henderson shared numerous ties of residence, including their daughter, Honal Greer, grandson Frederick Ross, George's brother, Houston Henderson, and Katie's brothers, Gail and Manny Culliver. Another sibling relationship is that of the Davidsons, including Alton and Talmadge Davidson and Missouri Davidson Hobbs. Members of the Henderson family seem to have purposely lived near the street, but other folks with family connections do not seem to be in close neighborhoods on purpose. Geographically, there are at least 8 people from Covington County, Alabama, and 4 from Escambia County, Alabama. And both are neighboring counties, extreme southern Alabama. These people include members of the Davison, Henderson, Culver, and Fegan families. At least one family group is from Colbert County in northern Alabama. Those are the Waddells and Wisdoms. Ezra Jordan was from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, which is near Covington and Escambia counties in Alabama. Overall, the residency and origin pattern is representative of the Great Migration, Black families moving north to take advantage of industrial jobs, and then encouraging further members of their families to join. In comparison with the 19th century data on the African population of Mansfield, company line residents show a shift towards more southern states, especially Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida, while almost no northern states apart from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois represented among places of birth. Our survey was originally confined to expanded right-of-way on either side of Wise Avenue. Archaeology survey revealed a high density of artifacts directly to the post-World War II occupation neighborhood, including intact features. Using boundaries as guides, we identified 22 sites corresponding to lots with houses on them. The density of artifacts and known occupation of the area, we consulted with ODOT personnel and received permission to test outside the area of current construction limits on South Wise Avenue. Reasoning for this further testing was this area seemed likely to be used in the future for construction staging or waste material storage, even though that's not in the current plans. This area also represents rear yard spaces, which are the focal points of outdoor activities of these residences. Therefore, it's prudent to investigate this area and see what can be found here. Sure enough, our investigations demonstrate significant potential for further studies. For historical and shovel test units, including a trash bin at Ezra Jordan House site. This bin was expanded into a 1x1 meter unit for documentation, with a few of the artifacts from the surface collected. Then we reburied it for future studies. Examples of notable finds from this bin include items, a base from an Alga syrup bottle, fine decorated ceramics, glassware, a flower vase imported from Japan, varied bottle in pharmaceutical bottles. A central portion of the feature contained an ashy fill, suggesting the burning of household waste or dumping of material burned elsewhere in this location. Deposit dates back no earlier than 1954, which is the beginning manufacture date for a bare aspirin pill bottle found in assemblage. There's also an Absorbing Junior bottle, which has an ending date of about 1960, but this bin could date as late as 1971, 1972, when the houses were abandoned. So therefore, this midden could represent a final house cleaning episode. I observed similar middens at farmhouses abandoned in 1930s and 1940s at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, which were produced when residents were to relocate, make room for expansion. Excuse me. Nearly every lot formerly occupied by a house on Wise Avenue is associated with an archaeological site. Using information from our research, we were able to probable occupant. Some of this information needs to be revised as more of the history of the neighborhood comes to light. A map included from 1995 reunion panel shows far more residents than we were able to identify in our research. And any future investigation of these sites needs to take this into account. Excuse me. No one knew who lived on each lot. A lot for the things they left behind and wider trends and events in American history. While the sample size is immediately limited, the survey results suggest a potential for artifact disposal pattern of residents using the rear portion of lots for refuse disposal. The highest densities of artifacts all seem to occur towards the rear of the lots. The survey results also demonstrate high potential for intact features, allowing for the study of the use and adaptation of residential lots by Black people during the mid-20th century. The types of finds recovered, including a variety of decorative ceramic and associate what we found here with documented consumption patterns associated with post-war cultural trends. Excuse me. Specifically, the sites within the company line neighborhood offer an opportunity to study Black participation in mass consumption through archaeology. Scholar Elizabeth Cohen noted that the national output of goods doubled between 1946 and 1956 and doubled again by 1970, which is the same period the Wise Avenue sites were occupied. Because of mass consumption, both white and black people broadly use the same types and brands of products, which makes distinguishing specific differences in consumption patterns possibly difficult. Products, which could influence the type of product represented in an archaeological assemblage. As Cohen notes, identifying as consumers may also have been a way for blacks to make claims on, quote, those wielding public and private power in American society, unquote, because of a shift during the Great Depression and recognizing the value of an individual consumer in contributing to the general economy. The assemblages from the sites in the consumer line neighborhood offer some potential clues of consumption specifically tied to cultural preferences, illustrated by a recovery of Alaga syrup bottle fragments at two different residences. Alaga syrup was first created and sold to the public in 1906 when the Alabama Georgia Syrup Company was formed in Montgomery, Alabama. Alaga marketing specifically used black celebrities, such as Willie Mays, Nat King Cole, and Hank Aaron, also alongside white celebrities. Inclusion of blacks in marketing efforts suggests Alaga was consciously and successfully targeting this market segment, possibly explaining the presence of typically Southern syrup at the company line. Other finds are more personal in nature, include such things as a lipstick tube from a site associated with George and Katie Henderson's house, possibly used by Mrs. Henderson herself. A highly decorated teacup fragment from the John Francis house site possibly relates to social visits, use of the best china for guests. 12 other sites illustrate everyday playtime of the neighborhood's children. Items like these are usually not accounted for in scholarly examinations of this part of American history, but they represent important parts of people's lives. In general, archaeology of sites considered to be modern is not frequently undertaken, but is rising in importance as we progress further away in time from the post-war era. Specific black sites of this period are very rare in the literature. Partly, the scarcity of mid-20th century sites may be associated with the 50-year rule of thumb used in evaluating sites to the National Register. Only very recently have post-war sites reached this threshold, so most compliance surveys and research projects have not prioritized their excavation and analysis. Of African American life is a robust research domain, exemplified by seminal works such as Leland Ferguson's Uncommon Ground, and numerous articles and research projects focusing on colonial, antebellum, and late 19th century sites associated with African American occupations. Notable African American archaeological sites just in the American Midwest include the site of the community of equal rights in Galena, Illinois, Miller's Grove in Illinois, New Philadelphia, Illinois, Little Africa in Roanoke, Missouri, and many others. However, none of these sites has a component that goes past the early 20th century, and none are related to the 20th century portion of the Great Migration. The Great Migration saw 1/6 of African Americans move north, residing in the suburb. By 1940, 1/5 of all African Americans in metropolitan areas were living in suburbs. The company line neighborhood may be considered something of a suburb, located outside the city limits for much of its existence. The types of houses being built along Wise Avenue in the post-war period appear from the photographs to be pretty much identical to minimal traditional houses that were popping up in suburbs everywhere during the post-war housing boom. Paul Mullins has recently examined post-war black suburbanization through the lens of material culture. His article on the subject has some important implications for the study of post-war black sites. He notes that people from working-class backgrounds often chose bold styles and patterns for household decorations and items, such as dishes and wallpaper. Antiques were acquired and displayed as part of this pattern. Thus, artifacts that seem too old for a strictly mid-20th century site may represent discarded antiques or heirlooms. Mullins also notes that items associated with everyday life are often not included in contemporary accounts of black life in the post-war period, so archaeological excavations may provide insights that are missing from documentary sources. He states that, quote, suburban materiality and shopping in an open marketplace was symbolically consequential, but specific material things and black houses escaped the attention of observers. He also argues that living in suburbs is a promise of uniting residents with like-minded neighbors, and material conformism that signified collectivity rather than the loss of individuality. Mullins has noted the importance of engaging with community members, especially elders, in combining memory and material culture and refuting stereotypes of an African American community. Mullen's work in Indianapolis shows how community members help explain how they displayed their conception of equal citizenship through their purchasing power and habits, which is something that's directly reflected in archaeological material and gives ordinary objects significance in a greater movement towards equality and opportunity. This approach could very well be successful here in further studies of the company line. A glimpse of this potential is seen through presentations and conversations I had with former residents at Mansfield in 2019. Former residents, Ellie Davidson, family built her home in the neighborhood in 1947, recalled sanitation issues, but also a tight-knit community that looked out for each other. He particularly noted homes were built by the members of the neighborhood, outside contractors. The neighborhood included bricklayers, electricians, and carpenters. Manny Culver operated a store out of his house. His relation, Don Culver, was Mansfield's first black mayor. I'm not
Hey,
quite
Andy,
sure if Don Culver actually. Hmm?
I don't mean to butt in here, but you spilled a little bit over into someone else's time. So
Okay, I am just about done.
okay,
Okay, I basically have one paragraph. So,
okay,
basically, company line sites archaeological remains in Ohio. It's a post-war African-American neighborhood occupied for only about 25 years, largely by the same set of families, then destroyed by urban renewal. Furthermore, it wasn't redeveloped after completion of the urban renewal project, which is pretty rare. So basically, we have these 22 sites that are frozen in time between 1945 and 1971. This presents an opportunity to use archaeological methods to study the suburban experience in the post-war period. It's a time of both some increasing prospects and struggles. I'd like to also note that this period is part of a new study by the Preservation Office to help classify and identify sites important to civil rights movements in Ohio. So that should also include archaeological sites alongside historical resources. The site representing this part of the company line neighborhood, I like to say, would be a great field school to educate students about recent past through archaeology and historical research, and it also would allow archaeologists to work alongside community members, recalling the history of African Americans in Mansfield, making that history a vital foundation for stronger communities of the future. That's everyone we worked with on there. Sorry for going over, and I'm done. Thank you.